Hey everybody, Bryan the writer here. I want to note you're going to see a little bit of a different background. That's because right now I am recording this in my sound booth, which is in the basement of my house, and it's made up of this blanket type material, which helps deaden the sound. So that's why it looks a little bit different today. There's also something weird about my autofocus today. I don't know what's going on. I think it's because it has nothing in the background to really bounce off of. So if I look a little out of focus in this video in a couple spots, sorry. It's just there's something weird going on with the technology today. Let me thank my good friend. He likes to say his name's James Wink. I call him Jim Wink. But anyway, I thank Jim Wink for this week's topic because he's the one that gave me the idea for it. What Jim wanted to know was, where do my ideas come from? Where does inspiration come from? Where do I draw that from? I thought a lot about it. I thought the best way to actually answer that question is to have a quick discussion about my creative process. What is that creative process that I'm using? I have to tell you that there's sort of two roads that I go off of when I have that discussion. One is when we're talking about descriptions, like descriptions of towns, descriptions of buildings, descriptions of trees or glens or whatever. That's one different set of inspiration than inspiration for dialogue. So let's talk a little bit about the inspiration for where houses and trees and that kind of thing. Where does the narrative description come from? You're going to find this very hard to believe, but as a kid, I was a very imaginative child. I was the kid who would get in trouble for writing these elaborate stories and having this elaborate back character and all kinds of things like that as a child. If you're a parent, you know what I'm talking about. I was the kid that talked too much in class. I was the kid who always seemed to be daydreaming. That was me. And I was given assignments where they said, okay, we want you to write 4 lines, or we want you to write a paragraph on such and such a story. And 2 pages later, I wasn't quite done. That's because, in reality, and this is still true today, I don't like the short form. I don't like short stories. I like to write long form. I feel like it gives me more room to breathe, more room to expand my area that I'm working on, the story that I'm working on. Good example of this is my current project, which I'm not going to spoil anything yet, but I really don't get to the other shoe really doesn't drop until about 4,500 or 45,000 words into it. There's, of course, a great hook at the beginning, but the major development, the thing that makes you go, wait a minute, doesn't happen until 45,000 words into it. There's plenty to keep you interested along the way. There's plenty of intrigue, but that intrigue doesn't start to get solved for quite a while. That's just me being me. I have the ability to put together stories. That is literally my only artistic bend. I cannot paint. I cannot do drawings. I cannot do sculpting. I have no ability to do that. When we would have painting in art class, I would try. I think they gave me good grades on that kind of thing just for effort, because I really wasn't very good at it. When I was a little older, I sat down at my grandparents' house and I tried to draw a house that actually sits across a little bay. I tried to draw that sucker for days. Never really worked quite right. So I think a lot of that has to do with the creativity that's inside of us. Now, that's not to say that I can't appreciate art. As a matter of fact, I love art. One of my favorite paintings is a painting in the Louvre called Ancient Rome. It's called Ancient Rome. It's by Giovanni Panini. It's wonderful. It's a huge piece of art, by the way. It takes up a good portion of a wall, and it's a companion piece. There's actually other pieces that go with it that were painted about the same time, and they were meant to be together. It's a wonderful depiction of basically it was written for, or it was drawn or painted. It was painted for the artist catalog, what was in the King's, or what was in the French, it was in the French collection at the time. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful painting. You see all these other little paintings in it. There's a couple of figures in the painting, and you can imagine that they're discussing a cataloging procedure for all of the artwork in the holdings at the time. It speaks to me in a way that no other art can. When we went to the Louvre, as an interesting aside, when we went to the Louvre, when the Louvre doors opened, we ran, basically, like I was dragging my wife through the Louvre Museum to get to the Mona Lisa. I wanted to see the Mona Lisa first thing, before people had a chance to flood the room. And I know some people are going to want to hunt me down and kill me for this, but the Mona Lisa, it's okay. It's not something that I find any real fascination with. That is not to say it's not good, but it's actually pretty small. It's not very big at all. It's probably about that big. People get the impression it's this huge piece of work. It's not. There are plenty of other wonderful things in the Louvre for you to see that don't have the following that the Mona Lisa does. And they're, in my humble opinion, IMHO, they're just as good, just as wonderful, just as neat to see. So, that's all my very long-winded way of saying that I can appreciate art, even though I'm not good at it, at some things. So going back to my first real inspiration, I would say that my ability to use my imagination in different ways was kind of always there. I would see people on a calm street, and I could look behind them and visualize a monster coming up out of the ground and killing them all. Yes, I was sort of a grim little boy. But that was my imagination. That's how my imagination worked. I envisioned monsters destroying buildings and vampires and all kinds of other things, and built these elaborate stories around what was going on around me because I could, because my mind allowed me to do that. It was a gift, really. I guess no one ever told me not to do it, so I continued allowing my imagination to run amok unchecked. My first novel is a novel called No Name, one that I don't even really sell anymore. It is technically not a great book in terms of writing. So there's a lot of things wrong with it, a lot of things I would have to go back and fix, and someday I will. But I love this story. The story is wonderful. The inspiration I got from that was I got for that story was sitting in a bunch of cars on a highway. I remember this moment distinctly. And I imagined myself using my mental telepathy powers to tear apart the cars in front of me, ripping them in half and throwing each half of the car on the side so that we could move forward, because I was really tired of being in traffic at the time. Amazingly enough, I was still a really impatient child. I'm an impatient adult. I'm an impatient child. Anyway, that's kind of where that idea came from. So that was really my first idea, inspiration that was turned into a novel. So let's move into Dirk Bentley, which horror a lot of times is a good balance, in my opinion, is a good balance of narrative and description. Narrative and dialogue. So you're going to have some good descriptions, but the dialogue really does carry that story forward. Now, when you get into like mystery, there's a lot more dialogue involved. Mysteries tend to be dialogue heavy. Let me grab some water here before we continue. So when you're writing dialogue, that really sort of goes hand in hand with this idea of having characters that are well developed. The Dirk Bentley Mystery Series, first and foremost, has as its central character Dirk. Dirk is our protagonist, absolutely. There are other minor characters that actually rise up to the level of almost being main characters in and of themselves. His girlfriend, Carrie, for example, is a good example of somebody that really does take up prominent roles at different points during the storyline. Same thing can be said of Keith. Keith, his best friend, also fills certain roles at certain times, plugs certain holes. The inspiration for Dirk, Carrie, and Keith really is my own internal dialogue. The way my view of the world is what inspires those three characters. They're almost a third of me in terms of what their personalities represent. Dirk represents the analytic side of me. For years doing analytic work, I have always been the person who is your qualitative analyst. I'm not quantitative. I don't do real well with numbers. I tried. Understanding math, that whole math thing, is the reason I got a degree in geography. It's not a ton of math involved. That is the part of me that I wish I could be. I wish I could be so good at what Dirk does, what Dirk has the ability to do. That's sort of a want, an ideal picture of myself. Carrie also represents for me, so she's a police sergeant. Since Carrie is a police sergeant, she is what I sort of lionize as being the perfect law enforcement officer. You may or may not know, I was trained to be a law enforcement officer at one point, and because of that, I have this idea of what they are supposed to be like in a perfect world. Because of that, I'm a big believer that Carrie is the perfect sort of detective, right? Keith is a Methodist pastor. He's also a part-time college instructor. He's also a bunch of different things. Now, what makes Keith interesting is he's really sort of how I would want to be as a pastor if I was a pastor in a perfect world. He is very even keel. He understands that he doesn't know everything. And because he doesn't know everything, he doesn't try to claim that he knows everything. And that's exactly why Keith is, or how Keith really views the world. And, you know, as a Christian, I'm a Lutheran, I don't really think I know everything. I don't think that we have everything figured out. In a lot of ways, Keith, and also to a certain extent the character of Victor, represent a part of me that you could cumulatively put together and say, this is what the afterlife looks like, at least in my humble opinion. So that's a big part. So you can see that other third of me, really. So let's talk a little bit about Crimson Tassels. I love Crimson Tassels. Crimson Tassels is very much draws its scenery from my childhood. I grew up in South Chicago, and what we would do is we would go visit my grandparents who had homes in Indiana. When we would go, it always, I don't know, there was always something magical and really beckoning about the corn country in Indiana. You'd drive along and it would be like corn, 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 cow, pigs, corn, 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 cow, corn, 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 oh, pigs, just a lot of corn. There was actually, by my grandparents' place at Bass Lake, Indiana, there was a beefalo farm for a while. It's funny looking animals. If you've never looked up what a beefalo looks like, it's a cross between a cow and a buffalo. Yes, it sounds strange, but they are kind of different looking animals. We also saw there a bunch of you'd see the old abandoned farmhouses out in the fields, and they would be there. I didn't learn this till later on, but there's actually good insurance reason to keep that there, keep those houses on the property. But I think that really did speak to me in that kind of place. Sure, you could make an argument about, Children of the Corn and that kind of thing really influencing me, but it was just mostly my upbringing and seeing that part of the world. Now, I also want to point out that the 1980s, so I was born in 1973. When we hit the 1980s, you saw the big corn crisis. So that was, for those of us old enough to remember, that was the whole not We Are the World, but Farm Aid became big about that time. Stars coming out and trying to raise money for the farmers. That had a heavy impact on me because the pain and the suffering of the American farmer at the time, that was a real thing. That was a real thing. That was a really tough time to live in and on a farm. If you were a farmer, that was a tough gig. So because of that, that kind of influenced me. So the very first chapter of Crimson Tassels, something terrible happens. I'm not going to tell you what, but it's totally worth seeing or worth reading. And that first thing sets the stage for what happens later on. I want to talk about the characters Jack and Elizabeth from Crimson Tassels a little bit because they have an idealized love at an age where everybody is young and happy and, ready to take on the world. That's Jack and Elizabeth. I am, in a way, those characters, I am making caricatures of real people that I've met in the world. That's the thing to remember about writing, is that a lot of the emphasis and draw for characters doesn't necessarily come from just your brain, something you've made up. It's real people. I've said it before that authors are the ultimate plagiarists. We take in media, whether it's, Panini's painting, or whether it's a movie you went to, or theater, or show, or whatever. You take it in, you internalize it, and you turn it into something else that you use to draw your characters, to build your worlds. That's what writers do. That's very much the inspiration. So like I said, it's really, really hard to answer that question of where does inspiration come from, because in reality, it comes from everywhere. Staying on Crimson Tassels for a moment, when I was in college, I went to school with a guy who did it was an older guy who was doing a master's thesis on the spatial distribution of farmhouses in Minnesota. What he was looking at was how many farmhouses were left out there. When were they built? When were they abandoned? How did that look? Very interesting piece of work, actually. So we learned a little bit more, and it sort of fed my imagination. That's why, at least part of the reason it takes place in a farmhouse, is I never really lost that fascination with that kind of world. As a matter of fact, most of Crimson Tassels takes place in the exact same house. So, moving on to Reapoke, there's still a firm Indiana tie there. In the book, Lake Oleander is referred to. Oleander, by the way, is deadly if you eat it, so don't eat it. That's why I picked it. It's deadly flower. It's actually patterned after another lake that figured prominently in my upbringing, Koontz Lake, Indiana. Still, by the way, I go out to Koontz Lake at least once a year. I always say I'm half Hoosier at heart, and in order to keep my Hoosier credentials, I have to drive out to Indiana and go spend time in the lake. Go get a sunburn on Koontz Lake, Indiana. Now, most of you likely have no idea where Koontz Lake is, because honestly, it's a destination rather than someplace should pass through. Nobody would pass through the town of Koontz Lake. It just doesn't happen, right? You're going there. I often say that people show up in Koontz Lake, Indiana in a moving van and they leave in a hearse. That's Koontz Lake for you. It's mostly made up of retirees and weekenders for the most part. My maternal grandparents lived on that lake, and my mom still lives on that lake. My aunt still lives on that lake. As a matter of fact, a lot of my immediate relatives live in and around that place. The tale in the novel, the character of Waylon talks about his grandfather. His grandfather tells young Waylon stories about the Koontz Lake muck monster, or the muck monster and the city at the bottom of the lake. Well, that's actually based on stories that my grandfather told me. And it's because of that they become part of the background of the story. There's no muck monster in Reapoke itself. But my grandfather told me when I was little that there was a muck monster that lived at the bottom of the lake. Koontz Lake, Indiana is famous for its muck. And it was there. It never, attacked people. He would say, uh-oh, that's probably the muck monster getting you. I don't know. It's what you tell young kids. It's what I told my kids when they were little, and it just goes on. It just perpetuates. He also told me a story that when Koontz Lake was originally made, because Koontz Lake was actually built, didn't just show up there. There was a stream that went through. Mr. Koontz, you can look this up online, dammed up the river for his mill that formed the lake. So my grandfather had told me that there was a city that was along the stream when he dammed it up, and it filled up so quickly that it took over the city. So in the young mind of a child, when you tell them a story like that, they, of course, still envision this city where people are still living and driving cars and doing whatever, but it's all under the water. This is what I thought. Again, I had a very creative mind as a child, so it's something that sort of stuck with me, right? The story of Megan, or the character of Megan in Reapoke, it's kind of an amalgam of characters. Part of it's heavily drawn off my own mother. Part of her personality is heavily drawn off my own mother. Megan's this hearty, capable person who takes care of things. She has her doubts about how good she's doing constantly. She'll say things like, if I had only been a better blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, nobody can fault her for the job she's done. She raised a capable young boy by the name of Kyle. Get to him in a second. So that's where the big draw for Megan's personality comes from. Incidentally, when I talk about these characters and the real people that they're based off of, also their voices and their actions and what they say, that's also heavily drawn off those people as well. So I'm borrowing that right from them. Kyle, said I'd mention Kyle. Kyle is patterned after my own son. And the reason that is so Kyle is, in the book, he's an Eagle Scout, and he's capable, and he's kind of jokey, he's kind of funny. That's my own son. So, again, voice character, dialogue selection, how he acts, what he does, that's all based off of a real person that I know in my life. Now, I want to talk about my daughter for a moment, because my first science fiction book, The Bryan Chronicles, incidentally, finishing up the second book now, there's not a lot of heavy emphasis to really bring it, it's within inches of goal right now. I've sort of backed off at a hair because of COVID-19, giving everybody a little bit of a break. We have to find out what this means for everybody around us financially. Anyway, we'll get to it. The Bryan Chronicles is going to come out this year. Promise you that. The character of Haley is actually based off sort of an idealized concept of what I want my daughter to be like in the real world when she's all grown up and moved away. How does she conduct herself? What does she do? What decisions does she make? Haley's a great woman. She's smart. She does the right things. She knows how to get what she needs to do. She knows how to handle situations. That's what I would want for my daughter, honestly, at the end of the day. So the inspiration for the idea of, let me try that again. The inspiration for Begorian Chronicles writ large comes out of a deeper appreciation for growing up as a child and reading Douglas Adams. As a matter of fact, the Begorian Chronicles is actually dedicated to Douglas Adams. If you've never read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I highly suggest it. Read all of them, the books in a series. They're wonderful. The thing I love about Douglas Adams and the way he wrote was that at the end of the day, he could say something that was completely and totally ridiculous. Made no sense whatsoever. But the way he said it, the way he put the sentences together, the way he put everything together, it was amazing. And that you would just sort of accept it and say, oh yeah, that's reality. That's got to be right. So that's the Begorian Chronicles. Now, moving on to my most recent work, the Dean Cordain Mystery Series. I loved writing Dean Cordain. Dean is a horrible person. He's a misanthrope. He is one of those people that you would never bring home to mom. That's just Dean, right? Dean is patterned after my brother. And the reason I pattern him... So, to say that he's patterned after my brother. So, the word choices, the responses to different things, that's totally my brother. Totally my brother. Now, I also read quite a bit of, or not read, I listened to quite a bit of Yours Truly, Johnny Dollar, which is an old radio program that was popular on the radio back in the day. And that was very inspiring for me. I loved being able to just listen and sort of see the action in my mind's eye. For a while there, that's like all I was listening to was radio dramas. Because of that, a lot of the pacing and style of the Dean Cordain mystery novellas, they're novellas, there's two of them now. By the way, the Diamond-Studded Legs Matter, and I forget what the other one is offhand. It's terrible, you forget the name of your own books. But those two novellas are drawn off of the radio programs of old. I think you can feel that as you read them. Very noir, by the way. Very noir. And that's on purpose. Even the very end of it, I sort of give that little hat tip to Johnny Dollar by ending them with Yours Truly, Dean Cordain. I wanted that tie to be in there. Because to me, that's an important thing. I like to continue that lineage, continue that sort of bloodline if I can, in my own little way. If I ever sat down and wrote radio scripts, believe it or not, there are people that do that, I would definitely write noir dramas. For this radio this is going to be also podcast and also video. So I want to thank you all for joining me today. And I hope if you're interested in any of these titles or any of the inspirations and you want to sit down and read any of these books, you can go out and find me on, you can go to www.briannowak.com. You can find my books there. You can also go to Amazon, but they're also available on a bunch of other ebook distributors out there, and you can pick up a copy and read away. And if you do read any of my books, by the way, please remember to leave a review. I greatly appreciate that. And so that's it for this week. Hope you are staying safe and healthy and away from COVID-19. Remember, wash your hands, very important. So anyway, I guess I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.